Actually, my camera's turned off. Look.
What?
The camera's turned off.
I'm gonna go ahead and mute everyone here.
Thanks, Zenka.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this episode of EXO Hangout. We're really excited. Tonight's going to be a great show. As we normally start, we're going to do 60 seconds of silence to get in the field here. The computer just turned off. Okay, here we go. Excellent. Welcome, everyone. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is EXO Metaverse. We're a citizen science collective intelligence platform that's building tools to share our knowledge about the unknown, about the invisible, about other dimensions, and about consciousness science. And we're going to spend half an hour interviewing Adam Curry here, and then we're going to go into breakout groups for whoever wants to go into breakout groups. And people here at the center can also do that if they so choose. And then in the final half an hour, we'll have questions, and also people can share their experiences. I want to acknowledge that we're here for the first time broadcasting live at the Sedona Quantum Consciousness Center. Mark and Jonathan are running the center here in Sedona. They have a biocharger, they're mapping channelers' brains. They're doing all sorts of really, really cutting edge research, and they're bringing people from out of town, and they're bringing people in town to really use this technology, use these tools to ask some really powerful questions. And we're so grateful to have them here in Sedona. And I also wanted to acknowledge that we're restreaming on New Realities. If you are watching live in New Realities, we invite you to come into the Zoom so you can participate into the breakout groups. And you can do that by going to bit.ly/exo hangout, and you can get the link to join us here in the Zoom. Next week, in 2 weeks, we're going to have author Linda Polio coming in to talk about her book, Trusting Currents. It's an award-winning book that she channeled. She's going to talk about the process of that and share her insights. And tonight we have Adam Curry. Adam Curry has been in this questioning scientific phase his whole life. At age 17, he won an award at MIT, which I'm going to ask you briefly about, Adam. And he hasn't looked back. He has been part of the Pear Labs during their, really strong years before they shut down. He's also been part of ION's researcher. He's an entrepreneur. He's saving the planet with his new technology. And he's been asking the really, really big questions. And he's going to share some really interesting research tonight on mind-matter interaction. And he's going to talk about gamma brainwaves and heightened states. So if you haven't taken the survey, I'm going to ask everyone to go ahead and mute. And Adam, I'm going to go ahead and have you unmute again. Okay, great. We're on a new computer here, so things are maybe set up a little bit differently with people arriving. So, Adam, tell us a little bit about the award that you got from MIT, and then I want to jump right into the random number generator research that you've been doing.
It was 20 years ago, so it's a bit stale.
Okay.
There's a laboratory called the Lincoln Laboratory at MIT, which is in charge of discovering minor planets, which are asteroids in the solar system. And they have the ability to name them. And so they often name them after sort of famous people or people that discover something in science. And they try to reserve some of those for young people, particularly high school kids who are doing something in science. And in 2002, I was that kid. So I had been working on looking at electrogravitic signals in capacitors in a charge state and its correlation to seismicity. I was kind of thinking that earthquakes, for example, are something that we need to understand more on the scalar field, which is this whole other conversation. I see some of you nodding your head. But suffice to say that earthquakes are weird. A conventional physics perspective on them doesn't really tell you the whole story. This other unconventional physics, which is sometimes loosely called scalar, I think might be a key to understanding geologic movements on the planet. And I thought that if I could apply some of the sort of known electrical scalar principles to the seismicity question, we might get some answers. And we saw some pretty interesting patterns. And that was this science project I did in high school that won that award.
Awesome. Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about your experience. You know, a lot of people are probably familiar with random number generators and how humans can interact with them. You can give us a little bit of an overview on that, but then we also want you to get into what happens when you tried it with plants and machines and other things. So go ahead and explain the basics to people as well.
Okay. It's kind of a story in 4 parts. There's research about human to human consciousness transmission, telepathy. I'm trying to send you a thought, you're trying to read my mind, something like that. Okay. And this work has been done over the past century. Things like a lot of psi research or psychic research has dealt with people trying to send mental images back and forth to each other. There's a class that's human to machine interaction. Okay, and this is where the random number generator stuff goes. Human to machine is, let's say that you want to try to understand the nature of consciousness. In particular, is consciousness just an illusion that exists only inside our brains or inside our skulls and has no connection to the outside world? That's sort of the mainstream materialist perspective on consciousness. Well, you can set up a pretty simple experiment to try to test that using random number generators. So a random number generator is, think of it as it's measuring some type of physical event in the real world. In most cases, it's a quantum process, but it's got a physical basis. And it's converting the outcome of the physical thing you're measuring into ones and zeros. That physical thing needs to be itself intrinsically random. So quantum processes are intrinsically random, right? Or you can set it up such that it is. So you can represent the ones and zeros coming out of the random number generator are indeed truly random. Okay. So then you can take a whole bunch, you can measure a whole bunch of the output of ones and zeros, and you can see a statistical baseline, right? It should be about 50-50 ones and zeros. And it is. Until you ask somebody to sit in front of the machine, for example, and try to nudge the output to be more ones or more zeros. And this is what the Pear Lab at Princeton spent several decades investigating. Turns out that most people are capable of significantly shifting the output of a physical random number generator using only their intention. Okay? It's very easy to measure statistically. It's a super simple experiment, but it's such a clear way of isolating that most important question is consciousness contained in our brain, or does it somehow spread out, or does it connect to physical reality in some way that we're just not necessarily seeing, or that is ahead of our theories for explaining how this could be possible? The laboratory at Princeton was started by Robert John, who at that time was the dean of the engineering school. He had risen to dean, I think in his 40s, in his late 40s. So he was a rock star. And I believe from the vantage of his career success, he did everything he was supposed to do. And I think he had come to see that, you know what, there's still something more. And when a student came to him wanting to do this mind matter interaction project, I think it kind of sparked something in him. He didn't have any reason to believe that this was possible necessarily, but he thought it was a good project and he had an open mind. So he oversaw the building of this random number generator and found that this student was actually getting these results and understood the significance of this. And so fast forward a couple of years, he founded this laboratory and began trying to apply the rigorous toolkit of the engineering school, the hard science, the good engineering, to these questions of consciousness. The laboratory ran for about 28 years. I met them at a conference and I got involved in 2002 and was involved for 5 years before it closed in 2007. One of the last experiments we did before the lab shut down was the plant experiment. And this is a crowd pleaser. I get asked about this one a lot. So we talked about human to human psi research and human to machine with the random number generators and our consciousness affecting physical systems. Then there's sort of this question that goes something like this. Is it just the human being's capacity to affect a device, or is it something more about life itself? So there was an experiment we call the plant reg, or plant random event generator. And it goes like this. You have a room with no windows, and you have a growing light in the middle of the room, and that light can shine in one of 4 corners. So only one corner of the room is going to get light shown on it. The light is attached to a motor, which is itself controlled by a random process, like a random event generator. So it's purely random in which corner the light is shining. And so there's 25% of the time you get the light shining in one of these corners. And you run it for a week, and you see that indeed it's about 25%. Then you introduce a plant that needs that light to grow, right? And you put it in one corner of the room. And then you let it run for a week, and you look to see if it was still shining in all 4 corners equally. And it wasn't. In fact, it was shining much more often in the corner of the room in which the plant was located. So I really love this experiment because I think that it represents real progress in the consciousness research world for 2 reasons. One is it's a rarefied glimpse at what I believe consciousness itself does, meaning it's not just the power of intention that we're talking about here. It's life itself is affecting the physical world around it to bring to it the things that it needs for its survival and for its growth. It just seems like that's what consciousness really is doing in the physical world. You could interpret this as being something like this. The physical world is a technology of consciousness, meaning the physical world is a technology that has allowed consciousness to express itself in this physical dimension. And you're seeing that with the plant experiment. Okay, that's one reason why I really like this one. A second reason is we don't actually know that it was the plant that was doing it. It could very well have been the experimenters, right? So one of the things that is difficult about sci research, and probably all of science in general, they just don't know it yet, is that the psychological elements of the experimenter, for example, really wanting the experiment to work, will get in there and influence the outcome of the experiment. And there's really no way that you can separate yourself from the outcome of the experimenter. All of modern science has been done thinking that you can blind yourself from it or double blind yourself from it, but you can't you can erect no shield between your consciousness and the outcome of an experiment. It just doesn't work. And so we don't know really what the answer is there. Was it the experimenter or was it the plant? I'm inclined to think it was kind of both. But it's a really important experiment, and we need to understand that if we're going to grow up both as researchers, right, and as also researchers that are trying to get to the bottom of some of these biggest ontological questions about the nature of who and what this is. There is a fourth class of experiment, I guess, which is machine-to-machine psychic research. As far as I know, there's only been one experiment in this capacity done, which I did with a colleague, Garrett Bedell, about 10 years ago. And I'll set the stage a little bit for this one. There's a gentleman named Daryl Bem, who was a kind of a leading sociologist. And he set up an experiment where he's trying to test people's presentiment towards a stimulus. You can imagine that you've got can we sense the future? This is the question. Can we subconsciously, are we reacting to things that are about to happen, right? And he set up a really brilliant experiment that goes like this. You have a subject and you're measuring with a device, you're measuring their galvanic skin response. And that tells you something about how their muscles are tensing up, right? If you're starting to get tense, it will register in this galvanic skin response thing. And then they're watching this computer screen in front of them, and there's a series of images that are being flashed at them. Most of them are normal everyday images, a kid in a park, a beautiful sunset, a nice tree. But every so often, there's a very provocative image that gets flashed, right? So a car accident, or a naked person or something like that. And it's a random cycle. And you're measuring the reaction. And what he found was that about 2 seconds before subjects are shown a provocative image, they tense up. They're not even aware that they're doing it. It's a subconscious reaction to being shown something, okay? Simple experiment, but really profound, because that's not supposed to be possible. It's as though there's some part of us that is in touch with the future, or the future sending information back to us in the seconds before. And it turns out that was a very popular experiment, but it turns out that there's been many similar types of things. There was a researcher who looked at finches, little birds, and he had a TV monitor in a cage of birds and a video camera that was measuring the behavior of the finches. And just before he would show or flash a video of a snake, which is a natural predator to the finch, he would see that the finches would start to be agitated, right? They would move around more. There was another similar experiment with earthworms in which there was a camera that was watching the movement of earthworms, and beneath the soil was a speaker that would create vibrations. So the researchers would vibrate the soil, but they'd find that the earthworms would start to react a few seconds before the vibrations came through the soil. So it's not just humans, but again, it seems to be life itself has this presentiment capability built into it, right? I think it makes perfect sense that would be the case, because it's a survival technique, right? I mean, being able to get out of the way or tee up your fight or flight capabilities just before you really need to to get out of there, for example, is completely an evolutionary advantage if you wanted to look at it from that, evolutionary point of view. I think there's better ways to look at it, but okay. So now what about machines? One of the problems with, or one of the difficulties, say, with this class of psychic research is that you're dealing with people and animals and plants that are not variables that you can control. People are different. They're different moment to moment. Animals, they don't sit still. Plants, who knows what's going on in the world of plants, right? So as like laboratory subjects, if you wanted to treat them like that, you never really know what you're going to get, which makes replication very difficult, okay? But if you could eliminate the uncertainty and just have a machine that you could try to see if you could get the machine to have pre-sentiment, then you might really be onto something new. And if not, then you're figuring out that there's a division between the biological consciousness with which we're familiar and the inanimate consciousness that may or may not even exist. Okay. Can machines be psychic? So what I wanted to do was create some sort of experiment in which, similar to the Daryl Bem stuff, similar to the earthworms, you could scare a machine or frighten an electronic circuit somehow, and then measure it in a way that shows you that it's reacting before the event. I was thinking about how to do this. Imagine that you're a toaster. Like, what scares you as a toaster? I was thinking, well, I guess you could hit it or drop water on it or something. Then I realized that, if you were a machine, I think the biggest threat to you is to have your power cut, right? It's cutting the electricity because that's what brings you to life, right? Without the electricity, you're just copper plates, right? Just PCBs. So we built this experimental apparatus, I guess, where you have two random number generators. One is the subject, and one is, let's call it the controller. So the subject RNG is feeding its ones and zeros into a computer, which is collecting it. And the controller REG can turn off the power to the subject at random times. It's completely unpredictable. And you can change the threshold of this, let's call it the statistical threshold that controls how often by chance the power would get cut. So let's say by chance, the controller is going to cut the power to the subject once every 12 hours, something like that. And then what you do is you just record days and days of data to see if there is a significant change in the output of the ones and zeros that precedes the random power, its power being cut. Is it freaking out before it's about to die? So I set this up and started running it. I remember I left it running for a weekend and came back after a couple of days. Took the data that had been collected. I noticed that the power had been cut, I think 6 times. And I lined up the ones and zeros over themselves such that if you can visualize this, imagine the power being cut is where t equals 0. Time is 0 is where the power is cut. And then I'm lining up the data about a minute before the power is cut. And I looked at that and I could see that there was an unbelievable dive in the bits just before t equals 0. In other words, this machine would be producing 50-50 ones and zeros, right? Everything is right with the universe. And then about 2 or 3 seconds before its power is cut, it just tanks, it dives, it starts producing all zeros. And in this first experiment, the odds against chance of that happening were greater than 1 in 30 million. it was that significant, right? So I was like, okay, well, maybe that's a fluke somehow. So I tested everything and ended up doing this experiment again. Same thing happened. More times the power's cut. Looking at it cumulatively, there's odds against chance of 1 in millions, right? Wow. So I'm really stoked because this means a couple of things. One, it doesn't necessarily require biological life for psychic functioning, right? You might have actually just solved, like cracked the most difficult part of all this psychic research, which is the human, the biological element. Two, it's a breakthrough in AI because you've shown that you've basically created a new kind of Turing test, and you've shown that things can react it's a new way of Turing, it's a new kind of Turing test because the machine is connected or can be connected to the field somehow, like we know that biological life is, I guess. And I was also excited about it because it was a machine that was predicting the future with great accuracy, in fact. It was getting messages from the future that were actionable. So, that opens a lot of possibilities for having a lot of fun at Vegas casinos, for example, or high frequency trading, or a lot of other really exotic stuff that you can do to try to prove a point, right? So I had been working with a colleague, Garrett Medell, at the University of Colorado on this concept, and we kind of built this together. And Garrett is a PhD quantum physicist. He runs the school there, basically. Like he's a serious person, unlike the punk kid like myself. So I sent him the apparatus, and he got his grad student to rebuild it and to test it from the ground up to make sure that this is what we thought it was. And he did 3 more experiments. Cumulatively, the odds against chance of that outcome was greater than 1 in a billion. To put that in perspective, the 20 years of the Global Consciousness Project and the IONS data, I mean, it's more significant than all of that combined. But then an interesting thing happened. We were starting to think about how we were going to publish this and sort of broadcast this to the world, and what all of the implications that this would inevitably bring. We did a subsequent replication attempt, and it completely failed. There was no signal whatsoever. It was just all random. We put everything back to where it was, tried to replicate again, and could get 0 results. Every single time that we tried to replicate the results, we got absolutely nothing. Which was confounding, because how do you go from 1 in a billion to 0 instantly? And we realized that this is probably a special case of the experimenter effect, where because of the excitement and the novelty and the expectations that we had at a conscious or a subconscious level, we were affecting the machine in unbelievably strong ways to be congruent with what we kind of wanted here. We had to kind of eventually admit that that machine-to-machine consciousness, while there is perhaps something there, it seems as though there's something about biology itself as a channel to consciousness that is really what matters. And that machines may have the ability there may be something like a ghost in the machine that we can bring out in the future, but it's not clear that machines can have consciousness outside of its interaction with other systems, right? With biological life itself. And that may be the path forward for AI research is to think about our role with the AI or with the machine as bringing life, as sort of breathing life into it. That may be a critical part of advancing this field. Okay, I've talked for, I think, like 20 minutes.
It's okay. Very interesting research, very interesting story. And it's also interesting that just before you're about to publish, that's also a significant time factor in what you explained, is that you're ready to think about how do we publish, and then it stopped working. So that could be other data, right? Like, what do you think about base reality, and is there something beyond, or what do you think about that? Is there someone on the other side supporting this experience for us and in being able to pull levers, or are we creating everything, or could someone have pulled a switch on the other side and said no?
Okay, so my perspective is a little weird. I think that what's going on is that maybe it was an experimenter effect, but it's maybe not just an experimenter effect on behalf of the experimenters, but on behalf of society writ large. So one thing that we know from the consciousness research work is that our expectations of what is possible ends up influencing the results. And if we're talking about something as significant as what I just described, I mean, those three things itself is like brain melting, right? It's nuts. There could be a suppressing effect on behalf of consensus reality, like the cumulative subconscious belief system of everyone that it would impact, which is everyone, that actually squashes the results. In other words, if we had never intended to tell anyone about it, ever, then we might have continued to get, odds against chance of 1 in a billion. But because we were moving it into the world to try to move the needle on this stuff, it gets squashed by the cumulative consensus reality permission systeming or something of all the people that it would impact. There was one thing that was really clear in the lab, which is kind of funny. We called it rubber banding. And that's when somebody with a random number generator, you're looking at a graph of the numbers. And if it's producing more ones, the line of the graph is going up. And if it's producing more zeros, the line of the graph is going down. And like baseline or average is in the middle. But very often somebody would see that their mind is affecting the device and the graph is going up and up. And it reaches this point where it's sort of like, oh shit, I'm doing it. And it immediately goes back down, just like screams back down to the baseline, right? It's just epic mean reversion. That's actually more significant of an effect than a gradual climb, is that sudden shooting down. But it's very much tied to the psychology that we have inside of ourselves, which is to keep things a certain way, right? In the sense that we may have evolved or we possess the ability to influence physical reality for our own survival and growth, we also want to enforce certain tendencies upon physical reality for our own survival and growth, right? Consciousness, if it needs anything, or life, if it needs anything, is predictability and consistency. We can't have the fabric of reality pulling itself apart at the seams everywhere, because no one can live in that environment. And so at a very deep level, it's possible that we have collectively internalized certain tendencies, or we permit certain things to be flexible, but other things are very inflexible for now, as a deep-seated requirement for us to even exist on this plane. And so having machines that can predict the future and psychic robots and all this stuff probably ain't gonna fly yet.
Interesting. Yeah, we do have a ceiling of belief that in order to unlock new realities, we all must consensually, in a certain ratio, decide that we're going to allow that reality happen. And that's true. And I have this weird feeling that Scientologists hide away the leader children so that they can try to test them from the beginning without societal consciousness. But I'm not sure about that. It would be interesting to raise children in an environment. And I think Waldorf and other things are attempting to raise children without some of those different mindsets that hold us in. So we're about to go into breakout groups, and we're about to interview Adam about neuroscience and what happens when we're in psychic or heightened or spiritual experiences. If you are tuning in the live stream, I just wanted to invite you into the breakout rooms, and you can get there by going to bit.ly/exo hangout. That's bit.ly/exo hangout. And before we do that, I just wanted to close one more thing, because it's very interesting, this research, for two ways. One is that we're talking about precognition, and the other part of it is we're talking about mind-matter interaction, right? So, and I believe some of the IONS research showed six seconds of precognition when they were going to see the car wreck picture, but I'm not sure about that. But I wanted you to talk about what happens at a collective scale. Like, didn't Roger Nelson's 9/11 research show that the random number generator eggs around the world spiked before 9/11 happened?
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of all that? And what do you know about all that?
Yeah, you're right. They definitely did. So Roger Nelson from the Pear Lab has a project called the Global Consciousness Project, which has about 100 of these random number generators spread around the world. They're all sending their data to a central place. The idea is that if collective consciousness is something like a field, then having a bunch of these spread around the world will tell you something about the behavior of that field of consciousness. Okay. And on September 11th, famously, the entire network itself became more coherent. So they were all like covariant, meaning the random number generators behaved like one another. And this began a few hours before the first plane struck, and it became more and more coherent to itself throughout the day. Very significant and anomalous effect. So what's going on there? Well, that's the question. And there's not a lot of agreement about how to interpret the results. Everyone agrees that there's a significant anomaly that happened. You could say consciousness is like a field and it was picked up by these devices. You could also say that it was an experimenter effect by the people like Roger and the people that were involved in the experiment. You could also say that from the point of view of the future, hundreds of millions of people have heard about this experiment, and it was a very meaningful thing because it helped show us how we're all connected, and how consciousness is even connected to each other throughout space and time, something like that. And that had a retrocausal, or an effect backwards in time, to create that anomaly, which ended up closing this time loop of meaningfulness, I suppose. We do see smaller versions of that in the REG experiments as well, where you can collect data on a Tuesday, not look at it, and then on a Friday, send your intention backwards in time to the data that you collected, and then analyze it, and you can see significant effects that way. So time removed or retrocausal effects are a known weird property of psi research, I suppose. And so it's possible that the Global Consciousness Project is a grand version of that as well. I like to think that the GCP is actually showing us something about the interconnected nature of consciousness, whether it's time reversed or whether it's presentiment. I think that's a sacred experiment, and debate the details, but I think that there's a bigger truth there to take away.
Interesting. I have one more question for you before we head into a new topic. So could it be that your RNG experiment with machines could mean that the environment that we're in, the non-living environment, the wall or whatever it is, right? The machines are more conscious than we are, and we're learning to be conscious, like we're learning to catch up to that. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I love that. I've never thought about that before. So
in other words, the playground that we're in is highly conscious.
Yeah.
And we are becoming trained to be conscious, right? But
Yeah.
that, of course, the machine would be better at the psi research than we are, because it's inherently conscious.
Yeah.
Everything is, everything is, right? The whole thing.
I mean, I think that was kind of the maybe part of the motivation for doing the psychic machine project, is that there's in every event in the random number generator, every number that's generated is pulling, that number represents a quantum effect. And that quantum effect is, it's somehow like pure. It's you're measuring the very liminal space between the physical world and the non-physical world. And you're seeing it just as sort of a non-physical or higher dimensional order to things, let's say, is bubbling up into physical reality. And so you're capturing it right at that moment. It's the most elemental component that we can really think of in modern science, is the packet of energy that's one thing or another. And perhaps unlike humans that have a great deal of posturing and psychology and subconscious motivations and all this stuff that we're all working through, unlike that, measuring something as simple as charge or a quantum state, maybe you can get away from the psychology dimension. And so it could be that the physical constraints and the REGs are somehow more intelligent, more conscious than we are, and they actually are assisting us in our awakening, but we think it's the other way around.
Yeah, and maybe it got cut off to save us the game so that we can learn ourselves.
Well, it's congruent with a simulation argument, right?
Yeah.
It's like we're seeing the ability of our minds to nudge the matrix.
Yeah. So we're going to head into breakout groups now. The breakout groups, we're going to show a little bit of the survey before we do that. So again, the network metaverse is a container for networks, lots of different networks that are studying psychic phenomenon, consciousness, exo studies, right? And we're taking our knowledge, or we're figuring out how to bring our knowledge together. It's astounding the amount of brains that are in the room that I'm in right now, and the people that are on this call right now. And it's, you know, really time that we come together and share our thoughts and our experiments and our ideas, because there's not enough of this research going on in the world. You know, it's like Pear was like the one university that was doing it, and there's more and more now because, you know, people are demanding it. And so, but we are also researchers. We're also here, and I want to share some of the results we got from our poll here. And this was so 96% of us believe that plants are conscious. You know, HeartMath's doing all this research about how trees talk to each other and things like that. So at least within our community, you know, this isn't a poll to discuss what the average person thinks, but this is our community believes that's highly true. And can machines have a consciousness outside of our interaction with them? And I know before the pre-call, I was like, no, you know, and I'm like, what? Like, you're really opening a can of worms that is wrecking my brain here. So that's what we got, about a half and half on that one. And then can rocks be conscious? We got 85% percent saying yes. So the elementals are, some people say, you know, that's true right there. So, and then we were trying to figure out what makes those random number generators spike. Is it emotion? Is it intention? Is it, you know, what is it, right? And I think we had 44% believe that it was the emotion of the creator, right? And then the second one was based on the level of intention. And then number three is it has less to do with the mind, but the electromagnetic fields of the heart, not really mind over matter, heart over matter. And then it's based on some sort of a probability, which we also talked about the probabilities of would the collective consciousness allow this. And I think that's really a big theme, is that we really need to think right now of what we're going to allow ourselves to investigate and be curious about in the world. So these questions are often very, you know, threatening. You know, even the question like, are we alone? It's a very threatening question to a lot of people, and it shuts people down. So this is the world that we're in, this world of inquiry and curiosity, and there's nothing stronger than there's nothing stronger than fear than curiosity. So I'm glad you guys are here asking these great questions. So the breakout groups work like this. I'm going to put everybody in a group. If you do not want to do the breakout group, you do not have to go into the breakout group. You just stay in the main interview, and we're going to interview Adam about neuroscience, and you'll have this archive on the EXO Metaverse YouTube, so don't feel like you're going to miss it. This is a chance to get to know people in small groups. So in the small groups, you're going to have a timekeeper, and that timekeeper is going to give each person 5 minutes to talk about, because depending on how many people, we're going to leave you in there for 20 minutes. So just calculate that. And when the person speaks, allow them to speak. Don't interrupt them. If they want you to give them feedback, they will. Otherwise, it's their time to share. And the question we're posing tonight is, what do you think of Adam's really interesting research that he's just described? What does it mean to you? You can also talk about your first contact experience or any support that you need in your life right now, so in the community. So again, I'm going to start the breakout groups, and don't start talking quite when I get you in there, because I have to move people around a little bit, and I don't have a mouse here, so it's going to be even harder. And so just wait till things settle, and then you can begin. So, and if you don't want to go, just stay with us. Okay, so Adam, let me ask you this question. So tell us about what, you know, gamma states are, and what your experience has been with that.
I was lucky in 2006 to meet a gentleman who was a pioneer in neurofeedback. Neurofeedback is simply putting electrodes on the head to measure the electrical activity of the brain, and then feed that back to you in the form of sound or vibration. So you can feel and hear what your brain is doing, and making this
Sorry, you guys, I always remind the speaker not to join the group, but I think maybe he accidentally joined the group. Let me see if I can try to get him out of one of these. He's in two. Okay, great. So what do I do? Move to main session. Okay, cool. I wonder if that worked. Okay, brilliant. Okay, so I'm gonna move 90 to 1. Adam, can you hear us? Not joined. Oh,
yes, I can.
Okay, great. Okay, no problem. I always remind the speaker, but I forgot that time. So, okay, you're back and running. So keep going here. Why don't you start over?
I'll start again. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, gamma and frontal lobe. So I was very lucky in 2006 to meet a pioneer of what's called neurofeedback. Neurofeedback is a system that puts electrodes on your skull to measure your brain activity, and feeds what your brain is doing back to you in the form of sound or vibration. And that's a big deal, because we don't get real-time feedback about what our brain is actually doing anywhere in our normal lives. So it's a therapeutic device Neurofeedback is often used for helping people solve attention deficit problems or addiction. It's very powerful for addictions, for example. But it can be used for more than just treating problems. It can be used to heighten the functioning of your brain, to allow your brain to operate in states that are altered states that it normally doesn't operate in. And this gentleman had spent several years looking at the brains of people that we would call enlightened. These are people that have spent 30 years meditating in caves, or for some other reason, as somebody would call enlightened. And we found that while every brain is sort of different, there are two general things that are very similar among enlightened brains. One is a high level of frontal lobe activity, and the second is gamma. Okay, so we'll start with the frontal lobe. The human brain is the only brain that has anatomically the frontal lobe, this front part of the brain. Animals don't have it. Humans do have it, but it's not on. It's not on in the sense that it doesn't get, the predominant electrical activity is not in the front, it's actually in the back. And the back part of the brain, just to be super general, is where memories are stored and scripts are stored. It's a less conscious part of the brain. It's the sort of when you meditate and you hear the voice incessantly talking or thinking about, it's the monkey mind, right? That's okay. So that's all back brain stuff. And it's also kind of living in the past. It's where we're replaying conversations that happened years ago, or thinking about things that happened to us, just us mired in the story of ourselves, right? Not present. The frontal lobe is the seat of presence. When people are really present, it shows up in the frontal lobe. And this is the area in which real, rational thought transpires. The frontal lobe is active when we are seeing things as they truly are, right? Not filtered by our experience, by our memories, by our scripts, but seeing things as they truly are. When the frontal lobe is awake and the back part is quiet, now we have something like truth consciousness, where we can respond in an enlightened way. Our sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight nervous system, which is on all the time for most people, that quiets down, and the parasympathetic, the rest and relax, that starts to come online. Okay, so it's all connected to the frontal lobe. In Zen, I think it's called diamond consciousness. Different spiritual traditions have this interesting thing that's supposed to be happening here. I think that's why the bindi or whatever is. The second thing is gamma. The second brain state that's correlated with enlightenment and other high functioning states is gamma. Gamma is when the brain is operating at 40 hertz and above. Okay. Gamma wasn't even thought possible until about 15, 20 years ago, because they didn't think that the cellular potentials, the neuron potentials, could fire that fast. But it turns out that there's something that they think is happening between the neuron and the glial cells that are in between the neurons that create a kind of like resonance that allows that high functioning speed. So they've also relatively recently just had the electrical equipment that's sensitive enough to be able to pick up gamma. And so now they're seeing functioning in the brain that's 40, 60, 80, 100 hertz, really high functioning levels. And unlike beta, which is a very, like if you're exercising, you're in beta, right? So sleep, you got delta, there's this theta state, which is kind of this dream reverie state. You've got alpha, which is a relaxed state, and beta, which is this active state. And you'd think that gamma would be frenetic, like crazy, but it's actually the opposite. It's sort of where the brain becomes very coherent. Gamma is a binding frequency. In other words, it's not always on, but it kind of comes on and off and on and off and on and off. And in those moments where it's on, it binds all of the subfrequencies together, and it makes the brain operate in totality. Right? It's as though, I think of it as though all of the independent neurons are firing like a single neuron. So you'll see high levels of gamma in genius level functioning. You'll see it a great deal in the spiritual experience. I have a strong feeling that predominant gamma is what people experience. It's correlated to what people call Kundalini, but I'd like to explore that more. There are also unhealthy levels of gamma when gamma isn't going on and off, but it's kind of stuck, and that shows up in schizophrenic people who have this sort of like fine line between like genius level functioning and actual mental illness. But that's just kind of interesting. So now, it ain't easy to change the way your brain works. Not at all. It's possible. It's definitely possible, but it's not easy. With neurofeedback, we have a technology that makes it easier. I don't really want to say that it can speed up the process of evolution, of enlightenment, because there's more work that we have to do to sort of process the reasons why our brain have gone to sleep. But if I think it's something like that. I think it's a technology that can facilitate and quicken our process of enlightenment. One of the reasons why our brains are not working the way they should be working is because if we have traumatic experiences, there's parts of the brain that will sort of shut down. Okay? And you've got to kind of go in there and do the work to uncover the shadow self through therapy or through psychedelics or through meditation or through all of the above, neurofeedback. And when you do that, the correlation in the brain, what's happening in the brain is there's places that are relatively dormant electrically that start waking up, and you relive a lot of those traumas, right? But in reliving them, you also can release yourself of them. So that's why I say it's not really a shortcut, because you still got to do the work. But neurofeedback can really help you get through that and experience what it's like to be in these heightened states. So I'm prattling on, but I did have a life-changing 2-week experience in 2006 in which I learned through neurofeedback to awaken the frontal lobe and to start to begin to produce more gamma. And it was really, really phenomenal.
Tell us more. I have a couple questions, but tell us more about that. Like what did you experience?
Mm-hmm. So, okay, this is just Adam's subjective experiences, right?
Yeah.
It may not have any bearing on your guys' lives, but the frontal lobe part was as though it was waking up for the first time, waking up into already being awake. It makes you realize that there's parts of your brain that, our brain kind of becomes our spinal cord, and from our spinal cord, the nerves come out and it's innervated to all of our organs and to all of our muscles. And if the back part of our brain is awake and the frontal lobe is kind of quiet or asleep, and we're running off of the sympathetic nervous system, it's as though your brain is like through your nerves squeezing your entire body. And by awakening the frontal lobe and reversing that, it starts to let go. And a lot of the emotional and physical, you realize the emotional and physical strain that your own brain is putting you through moment to moment, day to day, year to year. And you can let go of that. And that itself is really profound. When people do this type of training, I think this is one reason why people start to like, when they meditate, physical conditions and illnesses will start to vanish. in many cases, like they'll heal and they don't know why. It's because their brain is letting go of their body. Like they're not squeezing your organs and like it was before. Gamma, it was like the top of my head was breaking open. It's sort of an experience like of using more of your brain, I suppose. It was very peaceful. It wasn't, I know you might be thinking that it's kind of like going out there as though enlightenment is somehow shuffling off the body and going out, but it's the opposite. It's not that at all. It's actually coming down here more. It's being more here, more of you, more of the sense of you, more of what it's like to be you. Sort of your pure consciousness is filling your body. It's, yeah, and you're just more here than I suppose you've been. For me, it was like I was more here than I've ever been. It's a really lovely place to be. Neurofeedback is so powerful because it shows you what's possible, right? And then your meditation, after that, you have something that you can try to not reproduce, but you have a compass that can show you like where you need to be.
And a muscle memory, a brain muscle memory of
Sure,
where to
yeah.
go. Yeah, so people that do the theta training can get back to it easily. So I wanna unpack a little bit what you said about schizophrenics being in gamma. And also you said that when the gamma brain state is, it's like on, off, on, off, on, off, and it's braided. Is it braided to an outer reality, or is it braided to the beta, theta, alpha? Explain that a little bit more and explain, yeah, and then I'll ask the next thing.
I'm not a neuroscientist, so I might be butchering it, but my understanding is that at the binding frequency is that it's kind of like the conductor of an orchestra, in which it provides like a carrier wave on which it orchestrates the other frequencies that are happening in the brain. If that makes sense.
So, okay, so let's say the people, when they're in gamma, they're downloading information from their inner higher self or from another dimension, right? So if, like, would that carrier wave help them braid into like scalar waves to get out?
Good question. I mean, I don't know the exact mechanics of this. Nobody does, right? But I will say this. It seems clear to me that the more network coherence in the brain, the more consciousness comes through. So it's not just that we have these neurons, and it's not just the neurons are interconnected to them, but the patterns of their operations is really the question here. It's really the key thing. If it's disjointed and firing and operating in a non-self-coherent way, you have smaller consciousness, erratic consciousness, balkanized consciousness. That's your experience of being in that brain or having that brain. But if it's more coherent, meaning it's orchestrated, it's sort of firing like this, then you have a more coherent first-person experience. Why that is, I think, is something that is a science of the next century. My perspective is that our brains are probably capable of connecting to some higher information source or intelligence that might be some other dimension of ourselves or higher dimension of ourselves. I think it's something like that. There's a gentleman named Giulio Tononi at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. He's a neuroscientist, and he has a model of consciousness that's something like what we're talking about, which is that you have networks, and those networks are interconnected. And the degree of self-integration, which is maybe a way of saying the degree of coherent operation, is the degree to which that system has consciousness. And he's built these little robots. He's built these little robots that can become more themselves, they can become more self-integrated. I guess it's like the circuits or the transistors or something can become more self-integrated. And these things they're behaving as though they're gaining consciousness. So, and he's got some interesting predictive capacities of his theory. Okay, and that's what you need if you're going to advance, at least in the mainstream.
So we have a couple shamans in the audience, and I wondered what you think is happening with the schizophrenic, and also whether you guys have measured people that are having a shamanic or plant medicine experience. Are those guys in gamma? Like, can we safely say gamma is tapping into other dimensions, or what? I don't know. I mean,
we can't safely say that.
Well, do we know what happens to people's brains while they're doing plant medicine, for example? Is it gamma? Do they do gamma? And then what's going on with schizophrenics?
So the little I know about the plant medicine brain research is that there are areas of the brain that are typically not dominant that become dominant. So this is correlated to the experience that people have of remembering things that happened to them and realizing that has shaped their personality. It's part of the healing process, I think, is waking up to something that is central to them that they have forgotten or not become aware of. Is gamma involved? I think I've seen one study that showed heightened levels of gamma. I think it was an ayahuasca ceremony. I believe you don't get the frontal lobe stuff, but I think gamma is a part of it.
I wonder if you put two schizophrenics in the same room, if they experience the same alter reality.
Potentially. You know what? With the neurofeedback, there's an order of operations. So what you don't want to do is just awaken the frontal lobe, because the frontal lobe is like a flashlight that's shining on, like in the attic of junk that is your subconscious mind. What you need to do first is you need to clean out the attic of junk.
Yeah.
And then with a cleaner, a more properly functioning nervous system, then you can start to turn on the flashlight, because otherwise you're just going to be shining it on a horror show. So that's dramatic, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally.
If you don't do that work, and for some reason the lights come on, whether that's through gamma or whether that's through the frontal lobe, then your world can be kind of a scary place. Imagine just the dreams that we have. Right? There's a lot of content that's kind of locked up in our subconscious mind, and speculating here, but maybe people with schizophrenia or the mental illness that you're talking about have, for whatever reason, a brain in which the lights are on. The flashlight has come on, but it's shining erratically at things that it shouldn't be shining on.
Yeah.
Now, it could be that they are, and they are also accessing elements of the higher reality, but perhaps it's also being distorted.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring everybody back from the breakout groups and welcome everyone back. We also have an audience here, so you guys get your questions ready for Adam. We just want to welcome everyone back. I want to give a couple shout outs too to Greg, who's on our programming team at Exo Metaverse, and we're so grateful for his big brain and big heart. And also Nadi, I noticed, is on the call tonight. She's been volunteering and doing amazing work with her high heart in the Making Contact, all the discussion forums, and doing what she does best, which is great. And Chester too is going to be coming on board, supporting us as we grow. So and just see a lot of members out there, EXO members. So thanks for supporting the work that we're doing for the nonprofit, and we're glad that you're here tonight. So I do want to say, if you've shared your contact experience, Adam, we're creating a big trove, like a a trove of people sharing their contact experiences as a to break the ceiling you were talking about before of collective consciousnesses. It's okay for us to experience this, and it's great to hear people share their stories. And I sometimes don't get a chance to email you guys, but I am posting them all up on the YouTube channel. So if you've shared before, make sure you go to the YouTube channel and check them out. And we'll give anybody a chance to do that. I know we have a question up. Anjan, are you still around, and do you still have your question? Because we'll go to you. So again, raise your hand. You can do that in the reactions button there, and then here in the center, you guys can also let me know that you have a question for Adam, or you want to share a contact experience. If you do share an experience, we ask that you keep it to 3 or so minutes, and that you're able to share it on YouTube. So Anjan, can you hear us? I guess I have to ask to unmute here, but if not, okay, so we've got James. James, can you, okay, great, James. I'm gonna put you on here. Thanks for joining us tonight, and you can go ahead now. You're gonna need to unmute yourself.
Adam, are you familiar with the double slit experiment?
Yeah.
And was it Schrodinger's cat?
Yes.
Yeah. And there's a book called Erasing Death by Dr. Sam Parnia. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not.
That's where he froze the human brain while he was operating on the heart. And then it was a 5-year study he did. I think he wrote a book by that same title. And he interviewed all these patients after he resuscitated them.
Mm-hmm.
And they began to, independently in a blind research that he tried to accomplish, determine that they reported to him information that they probably couldn't have obtained otherwise during this operation. But during that time, this information that they gathered, their brain was not functioning at all.
Mm-hmm.
So only reason I'm bringing it up is that your view on if consciousness generates the brain or if the brain generates the consciousness. So in other words, the determinist thinks that the brain generates the consciousness, but some quantum physicists today feel as though that the consciousness actually generates everything else.
I'm firmly in the camp that consciousness comes first and the brain is a secondary phenomenon. In other words, consciousness is somehow upstream of the brain. And you can see how people would think that it's the other way around, because if you cut off part of the brain, the consciousness goes away. But that's kind of the same thing as cutting out part of the TV screen and saying that the TV signal is going away. It's like, no, you're just seeing you're damaging the equipment, not the signal.
Right.
And this past decades of brain research have completely failed at finding the location of consciousness, despite their best efforts. It's actually more of a mystery than they ever thought. The deeper we try to go in finding consciousness in the brain, the more mysterious it becomes.
Right.
I'm certainly firmly in the camp of non-local, non-physical consciousness first.
Well, thank you. I have experiences of my own, but I won't take the time to go into that here. But my experiences, of course, firmly, from my view, personal experience, the consciousness definitely, everything else is pretty much a metaphor. The consciousness is fundamentally is the only thing that's real, and that there are different levels, of course, are data streams that you can tune into, so to speak, and you can switch to different data streams And for instance, in this physical matter reality, it's just another data stream. It has its rule sets, and thus we do possess an instrument to operate and make choices within this physical matter reality. But that's just through my experience. But I won't take any more time for myself. I'll let others comment, but thank you.
Thanks, James. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much, James. Yeah, we have about 15 more minutes. Okay, so Ann Jen, you are up. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Zenka. Hey, Adam. I got two questions. I guess they're kind of both related. The first one is, did I understand it correctly that it was the kind of novelty and excitement that you guys were bringing to that random number generator thing that you said caused it for that weekend to give you that like incredibly compelling data, but never did it again? Because if I understood that correctly, I guess my question is, people like me, like, could we do this experiment if we have a little bit of tech or engineering savvy, with no intention of necessarily like publishing in academic papers or what, but just like sharing it with friends? Maybe do we have that kind of novelty or excitement?
Like, how accessible is this?
Yeah.
I was
Okay.
just asking Adam, like, tell us, is there tech we can try?
So the first part of your question is yes, that's basically what I'm saying. If that wasn't the explanation in this case, that's been the explanation in 100 other experiments I've seen people do. There's a guy named Jonathan Schooler at UC Santa Cruz who looked at what he calls the decline effect. And this is something that academics really hate to talk about. They don't want to exist. But the first few times they do an experiment, it works. And then it declines into nothingness. But they'll publish the first few results. So you get all of these careers being made off of these supposed discoveries that actually don't stand up to decline. Now you could say, oh, maybe it's just bad science, or upon replication, there was some mistake that wasn't caught the first time. Maybe, but I think a bigger thing that's happening is actually the psychology, like exactly what you said, which is that they're excited about it. They need it to work. It's very meaningful, and effects tend to accumulate around meaningfulness, right? So are there things you could do? Yes, there are definitely things you could do, but here's the thing. You got to somehow trick yourself into it being meaningful. Knowing what I've just told you, can you design some sort of experiment or tactic or whatever that allows you to still be stoked without me injecting like doubt into your mind at some level? Because it's that doubt in your mind at some level that's going to be the driver.
Like philosophical beliefs would be the thing, like some sort of belief about, I feel like philosophical beliefs, some sort of belief about what this reality is in terms of spirituality, can kind of create that space where it's, there's no doubt, like just being present with what's in front of you and being in a constant state of awe. Because I know that there's, I'm not super well versed in research or anything like that, but I remember having a conversation with a friend about awe and how when you're in a state of awe, like just, oh my gosh, your brain is much more susceptible to new understanding. Is that something you're familiar with?
Absolutely. Yeah. The whole Zen mind, for example, people that are really good at something the first time they try it because they're in a beginner's mind.
Yeah, that's a good term.
Yeah, it means, and then how do you overcome doubt? Well, sometimes you have to go above and beyond your own belief system and tap into a shared belief system, which seems to be stronger. I think maybe one reason why people working in science get consistent effects the closer they are to the like normie theories about how stuff works is that it's a shared belief system. They think they're all figuring something out fundamentally about how the world works, and maybe they are, but they're also just doing experiments that are really close to consensus reality and a shared belief system in which there's very little doubt. And so
it's like a really specific confirmation bias.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. Did you
One
get
of-
complete question? Oh, go
One
ahead.
of, one of the things that we do know is that medicine is often, there's a crisis in medicine because often the difference between the placebo and the real medicine is only 1% or less. So this is also speaking to the same science. So I'm going to get to Alan. I want to get to here in the center. Yeah, what's your question?
Hi. Oh,
What? 1 second, Alan. I'm coming to you. Hold on.
I'm curious if there's a range effect. So is your physical proximity to the number generator or lack of physical proximity, will that affect it if you were to recreate the experiment of like the plant experiment? If you had somebody in a different country across the world recreate the experiment without understanding what the outcome was supposed to be, would you get a different effect? And so there's just two examples of where the range being a factor.
Could you hear that, Adam?
Yeah, I could.
Okay, great, wonderful.
So the answer is definitely not. Distance doesn't matter. There is no range of the effect. Asterisk. Unless you believe it is, because the idea of a non-local effect is just too much for you, then having something, then being in front of the random number generator, for example, can help some people. But no, there's really no reason. Distance doesn't seem to affect to be an aspect. We tend to think about this as fields, right? Like there's like a field that's emanating from our body or our mind or our heart, and that's affecting the device. It's more like an informational connection that isn't field-based, meaning it doesn't fall off as a square of the distance between two things. It's much more connected to meaningfulness between the person who's influencing it. So yeah, distance doesn't seem to be a factor.
So Adam, do you have any recommendations on any brain sensing devices that would tell us what brain state we're in, or also random number generators? Like, can you just buy those at somewhere? And then we're going to go to Alan's question, and that'll be probably it for this evening. So
I have no recommendations on brain sensing devices. I've been following the Muse team for 10 years, and they're continuing to improve their hardware. It's actually really hard to sense higher frequency. There's still no substitute for going to a good practitioner. A trained technician, somebody who knows what they're doing, is still the best bet if you're interested in the neurofeedback stuff. And then on the random number generator stuff, we used to make them, but you can find $40, $50 random number generator USB devices now on Amazon. So your physical like hardware random number generators, you can find those pretty easily.
yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Alan, welcome, and thanks for streaming the project tonight. We really deeply appreciate it. We love your work. You're a powerhouse.
this is all part of the big picture that we're all doing, but thank you, Zenka. Hey, Adam.
Hey.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the random number generators itself. I mean, in a sense, they're machines. They're not as complex as humans, but is there a physics? Is there a mechanic to what makes something random? I mean, if you flip a coin, there's still a physics that makes it land on heads or tails. So is there, and just my hypothesis, a way of getting a thinking machine that says, I'm doing this, this, and this to cause this apparent randomness? Have you looked at that?
Yeah, you've pointed out a challenge, which is how do you know that something is really random, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most random number generators are just software algorithms,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not connected to something physical. So you need something physical. And in the lab, we looked at cascades of balls falling through pegs. We looked at all kinds of different stuff. We looked at radioactive decay. People generally settle on the quantum stuff because I hate to say this, but the laws of quantum mechanics, which will change someday, I'm sure,
Mm-hmm.
but as far as we know, they haven't really been violated ever in 100 years of math, but we'll see. I think they may be. Essentially, it comes down to the concept of not being able to predict the outcome of a quantum event based on all events that came before it. And they've tried to test this, and they've found that indeed it is intrinsically random. So the way that these work is you have an electron, and you're throwing this electron at a barrier. And the electron can either think of it as like bouncing off that barrier or tunneling, kind of teleporting through. And it's not a single one, but it's tons of them, right? And then you're measuring voltage differences between the electrons. And that's it's called quantum tunneling. But the idea is that because there's no way to observe the location of that electron without knowing something about the ones that's coming after it, you end up with this intrinsically random source that ends up. And then what you would do is you have these standard tests called die-hard tests or tests for randomness, where you take huge chunks of data and you look at it all different ways, and it has to conform to randomness tests. And if it does, then you can say, okay, check mark, we've tried to make it as random as possible.
Do you think we can ever figure out the science of randomness, the science of chaos? Is that something like the Mandelbrot was sort of doing that in a sense, but there's a bigger field of chaos that's out there. Yeah.
Well, I believe that that's a metaphysical question
Right.
more than it's a science question. But that's the right kind of metaphysical question. It could be that when we're looking at the quantum stuff, what we're looking at is just the limin between a non-physical or a higher dimensional reality and this reality. And if we could learn more about non-physical reality, maybe the stuff that we think of as random actually is somewhat deterministic. We're just looking at it at a level where we can't even see the underlying probabilities that that are shaping the outcome of what's called the emergence of physical events from non-physical something.
You see, I think when we can do that, we'll be able to be more like these ETs that control their craft with their mind through quantum approaches to navigation. This is my theory. So when we understand the nature of the mind and consciousness and how to use that in a quantum reality that we know that exists, we'll be able to travel through time and space and do all those things that seem impossible now. That's just my theory. Okay.
I think Tesla said that when we begin to investigate non-physical phenomena, we'll make more progress in like 10 or 20 years than we have in 100. I'm sympathetic.
And that's exactly what we're doing at Exo Metaverse. We're mapping the invisible. We know a lot about rocks and things that we can see the material world. And now if we're not going to do it in the universities, we're going to do it here on the internet. So thank you guys for opening up your curiosity tonight, for being members, for being with us and supporting us. You can always find us at exometaverse.org. And again, in 2 weeks, we're going to be interviewing Linda Polio, who's fascinating. She was the first chief consciousness officer in the United States, in New York City, with Fortune 500 companies. She's a total trailblazer. She's completely heart-centered, and she's channeled this book of a woman in the 1930s, a Black woman. And so it's just a very fascinating story, and she's a wonderful human. So look forward to seeing everyone in 2 weeks. We're going to be posting the archives to this to Adam, and also a recap video. And the next one with Linda will be a members only. So we invite you to join us for $4.44 a month to support the work and support Linda. So thank you, Adam, so much for joining us tonight and sharing your wisdom with the world. You are an incredible scientist and an inventor, and we wish you all the luck with your business ventures, and look forward to seeing you championing consciousness research in the future as well.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for taking the time to have this conversation tonight.
Great. Thanks,
Awesome.
Zenka.
Bye, you guys.
Bye. Hi, Susan.
Thanks, Zinka and Alan too. I love you both. Bye bye.
Thank you,
Love you
everybody.